Morning, everyone. So, a strategic Bitcoin reserve was signed into law last night. So, why is Bitcoin still cheap? Why is it not already gone all the way to the moon? Why is the price not way, 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 way up? The short take is because financial markets of any kind are irrational in the short term. But let's talk through all of it. Okay, so what actually happened? Well, last night, Donald Trump signed a strategic Bitcoin reserve into law, along with, separately, a digital asset stockpile. The strategic Bitcoin reserve will hold only Bitcoin, the real Bitcoin, BTC, the real Bitcoin that's trading at about $90,000 per coin right now. That is the only thing that will be in the strategic Bitcoin reserve. It states that the U.S. government will not ever sell any of the Bitcoin in the reserve and will only acquire. It shall find tax that the Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of Commerce shall find ways of acquiring more Bitcoin that is budget neutral, meaning they cannot use direct tax dollars to buy Bitcoin, but they can come up with all sorts of creative, roundabout, indirect ways of using financial resources of the U.S. government to buy more Bitcoin, which they will do. So the U.S. government will be buying Bitcoin for the strategic Bitcoin reserve. So the strategic Bitcoin reserve, the Bitcoin that the U.S. government already has, which is about 200,000 Bitcoin, that goes in the strategic reserve and they only add to it by buying more. Separately, there is a digital asset stockpile. All of the digital assets other than Bitcoin that the U.S. government owns will go in a digital asset stockpile. The government will not buy any more of those assets and will only sell those assets, not buy. So the Bitcoin never gets sold and only bought, and everything other than Bitcoin only gets sold but never bought. So they both get moved sort of separately. The Bitcoin goes into a strategic reserve. The other stuff goes into a digital asset stockpile. The reserve only grows, the stockpile only shrinks, unless they get more of the stockpile assets through civil asset forfeiture or criminal forfeiture of some kind. Okay. So huge news and very positive for Bitcoin. The upside, because they're not directly using taxpayer dollars to buy Bitcoin, is that nobody has a reason to be upset about this thing. So even the people who are not fans of Bitcoin, or even the very small, shrinking, dwindling number of people that hate Bitcoin for some ridiculous reason, have no reason to be upset because their tax dollars are not directly going to buy Bitcoin. So they have nothing to complain about. One second. So huge upside there. Nobody can complain that their tax dollars are buying Bitcoin when they don't want to. The government will, however, buy more Bitcoin. They'll just do it through creative, indirect means. And the bill or the executive order actually says shall. It's not may buy more Bitcoin. It's shall buy more Bitcoin. So anyway, so very positive. As you know, I've never been a huge fan of the government owning the best money in the world. I think the pros of a strategic Bitcoin reserve outweigh the cons. The cons being that the government owns more of the best money in the world, which means you own potentially less of it, because the more the government owns, the less there is for you. So I'm not a fan of the government owning Bitcoin at all, but if they're going to own it, it's better to be in a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And obviously, that has a huge positive signaling effect to the marketplace. So there, even in 2025, where it's obvious to everyone that Bitcoin is the future of money. Well, not everybody. It's obvious to everybody who's spent at least 100 hours studying it that Bitcoin is the future of money. There's still a huge number of people that have not done the work, including hedge funds, family offices, Wall Street investment bankers, and all of that, who are looking for signals from the marketplace to say, hey, is this asset safe? Is it mainstream? Is it something that's going to be widely adopted? Well, the number one most powerful, largest economy in the world just established a strategic Bitcoin reserve yesterday. So if you're on Wall Street and you're just not sure if this Bitcoin thing is real, or if you're just not sure if it's sticking around, the number one most powerful country in the world just adopted a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So if that leaves any doubt in anyone's mind, I don't know how that even is. So anyway, huge news. The language of it is very well crafted. The people who crafted it clearly knew what they were doing, differentiating between Bitcoin and the other sort of, in my opinion, junk digital assets. They clearly knew what they were doing by the way they structured it to eliminate any blowback from anyone complaining about their tax dollars being used to buy Bitcoin, but also the way they structured it with a strategic asset, strategic reserve for Bitcoin, and only an asset stockpile for the other stuff, and the way they structured it where Bitcoin can only be bought and the other stuff can only be sold. Anyway, so it's really brilliant. It's really well written. It's very straightforward, and it's just beautiful. So, all right. So the second question is, if this big game changing worldwide news for Bitcoin just happened last night, less than 24 hours ago, how is Bitcoin only at $90,000 per coin? The answer is because markets are very irrational in the near term. First of all, Bitcoin and all other assets are facing huge headwinds right now with global uncertainty. Bonds in Europe are really, really, really high as people are just worried about sort of, massive recessions, massive money printing, massive instability. China's economy is having all sorts of issues. So slowly things are marching from huge problems in China. Now there's huge problems in Europe. And now we're seeing some of those cracks and problems in the U.S. economy with, companies and governments just under mountains of debt. And when people get that way, they just start selling stuff, even if it makes no sense and it's not rational. They just sell stuff because they're scared. So Bitcoin is subject to that as long as with all other assets. But the other thing too is people have an unbelievable ability to have expectations higher than any reasonable reality. So this happens very frequently with financial markets where, for example, Amazon will announce that their profits doubled the previous quarter, but the stock price will actually go down because everyone was hoping that the profits would triple the previous quarter. So it's almost like no matter what you do, it's very difficult to impress anyone in financial markets, which is why positive news is often met with a drop in that asset's value. Again, it happens all the time with Amazon, Tesla, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Nvidia, and the largest, most successful companies ever. In the near term, they get a stock drop because some new news they announced was slightly less amazing than whatever they could have hypothetically announced that people were hoping. So again, this happens all the time where companies will announce record earnings, but everybody was expecting sort of record plus earnings, or they, instead of doubling, they were expecting tripling. So apparently, when the announcement happened yesterday, there were a bunch of short-term traders. These are people buying and selling Bitcoin on a daily basis, an hourly basis, or even minute by minute, which virtually everyone who tries to do that loses money. Like more than 99% of people who try to do that with any asset like Bitcoin lose money in the long term. But everybody just, not everybody, the people who try to do it just they can't help themselves. They're like degenerate gamblers. But anyway, so a bunch of people had bought Bitcoin thinking that when a strategic Bitcoin reserve got announced, that the US government was somehow going to buy like some gazillion trillion dollars of it the next day. Well, that was never going to happen. There's not the political will to do that right now, because Bitcoin's not well known enough among the average people for that to be like a huge thing that the government's going to do. I mean, still a tiny percentage of Americans own Bitcoin, a tiny percentage. So the government was not going to wake up and buy $1 trillion of Bitcoin this morning. That was never going to happen no matter what. So some of the people who are selling Bitcoin right now, for last night, it's mostly recovered. So at $90,000, the dip, the executive order was signed, the price dipped for a matter of hours, and now it's basically back to higher than it was before the executive order was signed. But in that dip, the people who were selling Bitcoin were people that were disappointed that the government was not going to buy insane amounts of Bitcoin the very next day, thereby making them rich on a 24-hour trade. Again, all that's stupid. It's high school drama. What does this mean? What this means in the grand scheme is the number one most powerful country in the world with the largest economy in the world just established a strategic Bitcoin reserve. What does that mean? It is now much more likely that companies will establish strategic Bitcoin reserves, that other countries will establish strategic Bitcoin reserves, that individuals will acquire more Bitcoin. So in the long term, this is insanely positive, and the upside is incredible. In the near term, people will be irrational and people will do stupid stuff and people will have unrealistic expectations and people will misread executive orders, and it's just humans acting like humans. The same thing happened last year with the exchange traded funds. The Bitcoin ETFs, exchange traded funds, were the most successful ETF launch in all of ETF history, which is a huge deal. It was one of the most successful things that's ever been released on Wall Street was the Bitcoin exchange traded funds that let you buy Bitcoin easily within a retirement account or a brokerage account. So, right after that was announced and went live, the price temporarily bumped up from like 47,000 to 49,000. And then over the next couple of weeks, it dipped all the way to under 40,000 before rebounding and then ultimately going up to now 90,000. Or even before Donald Trump was elected, it went as high as 74,000. Okay, so the price almost doubled, but in the near term, right after the ETFs were announced, it dipped. Well, why did it dip? Why did it dip? Because some short-term traders were expecting they were expecting literally every person on the planet to immediately buy unlimited amounts of Bitcoin the same day. Well, that was not going to happen. It takes people time to understand Bitcoin. It takes them a time to allocate, financial resources to move things around, to get things set up, to buy the Bitcoin they want to buy, and that takes time. So, in the week or two after the ETFs were approved and started trading, there was a dip in the price before it recovered, and then ultimately the price has more than doubled now from that price. Um, so what was going on there? Well, the same thing. Traders had irrational expectations and they got, screwed out of their Bitcoin and they sold and they walked away and then it went way up, which is what happens regularly. So you may be thinking, well, why would I not wait for positive news and then the dip after the positive news to buy Bitcoin? And the answer is because it's erratic, because people are irrational. So if you had done that on election night on November 5th of last year, you would have completely and totally missed out because unlike the Bitcoin ETF launch or the strategic Bitcoin reserve announcement, there was no dip when Donald Trump was elected. Basically, Bitcoin went on a tear from 90, what was it, 67,000 to $109,000. And again, now it's at 90, but even if you look at it from today's price of 90,000, it went on a tear from 67,000 to $90,000. That's a 50% or something like that, not quite, a massive uplift on the price. Um, and there was no dip. So, sometimes there's a dip after positive news because people were expecting something even more. Often there's not a dip after positive news. The price just takes off. There's absolutely no way of predicting whether the short term traders that are completely irrational, there's no way of predicting how irrational or which direction irrational they will be, which means all you can do is the same thing you can always do, which is buy as much Bitcoin as you can and hold on to it as long as conceivably possible. One second. So was the news yesterday extremely positive? Yes. Did the price dip in the few hours after? Yes, for completely irrational reasons. Is the price back up to above where it was yesterday? Yes, it is right now. Now the stock market opens. It's 8:03 a.m. The stock market opens in 27 minutes at 9:30 Eastern time, which is 8:30 Central time. So the stock market opens in 27 minutes at 8:30 a.m. Central time, and I don't know what's going to happen. Is everybody on Wall Street going to realize that this is a huge deal and buy Bitcoin? I don't know. It's probably going to take time. Are the people on Wall Street going to be the same as the short-term traders that saw the Bitcoin reserve? We're hoping that the U.S. government was going to buy hundreds of billions of dollars instantly, and it's not. It's going to buy it slowly and in a roundabout way. And are people on Wall Street going to dump the Bitcoin at 8:30 a.m. this morning? I have no idea. It makes no sense. These short-term traders are completely irrational and do stuff that makes just no sense all the time. And again, it's not unique to Bitcoin. They do this with every asset. So all that matters is the long term. And in the long term, this news of a strategic Bitcoin reserve that was signed into law yesterday is a huge deal. It is a huge deal for the long term of Bitcoin, which means if I were you, you should do what I'm doing, which is buy as much Bitcoin as you possibly can and hold it for as long as conceivably possible. That's how that works. And again, in the long term, the Bitcoin exchange traded funds, ETFs, have been huge for Bitcoin. Bitcoin has more than doubled in price since the Bitcoin ETFs were approved. But it took some time. And the same is true here. This is a huge deal. It'll take some time. Maybe it won't take some time. Maybe we'll just go straight up vertically for a while. I don't know. Maybe it'll dip. Maybe it'll go sideways grind, trying to shake everybody out for months before it goes up. I don't know. But what does matter is in the long term, I believe Bitcoin will outperform every other asset you could possibly own. The news yesterday about the strategic Bitcoin reserve was very well crafted. It hit the sweet spot, in my opinion, of good public policy, especially for someone like me who does not want the U.S. government to buy up all the Bitcoin or even a lot of the Bitcoin. So it was crafted beautifully, very positive. I think it hit the sweet spot. It's just right. And now, most importantly, probably the thing I'm most excited about from yesterday is it gets the strategic Bitcoin reserve out of the way. Because what I really want, as for those who have watched all my videos know, what I really want is the elimination of capital gains tax on Bitcoin. That would be a much bigger deal for Bitcoin than a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The reason for that is the number one thing that is holding Bitcoin back from being used as a transactional medium of exchange for people buying coffee and everything like that. Obviously, there's infrastructure that has to be in place with point of sale terminals and everything that support Bitcoin. But the number one thing from a public policy or regulatory or tax perspective is capital gains tax on Bitcoin. Now, if you're using the Coinbase debit card from Coinbase, they keep up with all of your taxes, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're using any other Bitcoin service, they all try to keep up with your taxes, but it's a little hit or miss. A lot of people do not want to use Bitcoin to buy stuff because they're afraid of how they're going to have to keep up with and track the capital gains on Bitcoin. So if you buy it at 90,000 a coin, you buy a cup of coffee at $110,000 a coin, you have a capital gains on that $3 cup of coffee, you owe, whatever it is, 10 cents of capital gains tax or 2 cents of capital gains tax or some microscopic amount. It'd be whatever it is. You bought it for, well, let me do the math. You bought $3 of Bitcoin at 90,000 a coin. You bought a $3 and I don't know, 30 cent something at 100,000 a coin. Your gain was 30 cents. Your tax rate is 20%. So you owe 20% of 30 cents. And so you owe like 6 cents. So, but people don't want to keep up with that. They're like, hey, I'm buying everything at a 20 or 30 or even 50% discount in my life, or in my case, even more than that. But, you know, that still means when everything's massively on sale, there's still some tiny amount of that is capital gains tax. So now that the strategic Bitcoin reserve is out of the way, it lets all of the people that were focused on the strategic Bitcoin reserve, that massive army of lobbyists and political consultants and lawyers and accountants and all of those people that are representing the cryptocurrency industry as a whole, it lets all of those people pivot to the elimination of capital gains tax on Bitcoin and any other cryptocurrencies that are made in America. Nobody knows where Bitcoin was made because nobody knows where Satoshi Nakamoto was from, even though almost everybody speculates that he was an American. Anyway, most of the candidates that could have been Satoshi Nakamoto are Americans. But anyway, all of the discussion around that involves Bitcoin and any other cryptocurrency that's made in America being exempt from capital gains tax. So now the best thing about the strategic Bitcoin preserve, literally the best thing about it, is it lets everybody pivot to the elimination of capital gains tax on Bitcoin and other made in America digital assets. Which would be a huge deal because it would pave the way then for Bitcoin being used as a transactional medium of exchange for day-to-day purchases without having to use something like the Coinbase debit card that's going to track everything, including all the taxes on the back end. So that is what I am most excited about. I am most excited about the strategic Bitcoin reserve to get it out of the way so that we can focus on the elimination of capital gains tax, which will then massively accelerate the adoption of Bitcoin as not only a store of value asset and that function of money, but as a transactional day-to-day medium of exchange without having to use something like the Coinbase debit card to keep up with all of your taxes and stuff at Coinbase on the back end. So huge news yesterday. It'll take time for that effect to play out in the market and for the price to reflect it. But huge news yesterday with the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Same advice as always, even though it's not financial advice. So buy as much Bitcoin as you can and hold on to it as long as conceivably possible. That has never been a bad plan.